Why was she the only one not laughing? The words cut through the air like a blade. Get back in the truck, sweetheart. This is a grown-up's table and we don't need a clerk getting a paper cut. The training hangar erupted. 250 of the nation's most elite warriors, Green Berets, Rangers, SEALs, Marine Raiders, turned their heads as one. The laughter wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was the kind that bonds a crowd at someone else's expense. Easy, complicit, familiar. Master Sergeant Rex Thorne stood at the center of it all, a mountain of muscle and arrogance. Neck thick as a telephone pole, reputation built on brutal efficiency. His target stood near the edge of the training mats, in a space reserved for observers and support staff. She held a clipboard, the very symbol of everything he'd just mocked. She was unremarkable in every way these men were remarkable. Where they were sculpted muscle and sun-weathered skin, she was average height, slender build. Her uniform hung with neat but unimposing looseness. Hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun, revealing a face that was plain, serious, utterly devoid of reaction. She did not flinch, did not blush, did not even meet his gaze. Her eyes remained fixed on the center of the mat, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. Her silence was a strange, dense thing in the suddenly loud room. It didn't feel like fear. It didn't feel like intimidation. It felt like a deliberate absence, a pocket of calm in a vortex of testosterone and derision. From a raised platform overlooking the training floor, Colonel Evans watched. A frown creased the corners of his eyes. He was a legend in the special operations community. A man who'd fought in conflicts most people only read about in classified reports. He saw Thorne's cheap theatrics and was about to intervene, to put a stop to the unprofessional display. But then he saw her. He saw the way she was standing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to Evans it was a thunderclap. Her feet weren't shoulder-width apart in a typical Atis stance. They were positioned with geometric precision. Weight distributed not evenly but with a slight bias toward the balls of her feet, a posture of perfect, patient readiness. Her shoulders relaxed, hands hanging loosely at her sides, the clipboard held in her left hand not as a shield but as a simple object. Its weight and balance already calculated and incorporated into her center of gravity. It was a stance of profound, dangerous stillness, a ghost from his past. Evans leaned forward, his interest piqued, his reprimand forgotten. The spectacle was no longer about a bully and his victim. Something else was about to happen, something he recognized from battlefields and black sites across 3 continents. The laughter died down, but a palpable tension remained, a shared curiosity about how this unassuming woman would respond to the public humiliation. Thorne, basking in the attention, clearly interpreted her silence as weakness. He saw a timid clerk frozen by fear, decided to press his advantage, to turn this into a memorable lesson for the operators under his tutelage. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he boomed, taking a swaggering step toward her. "Look, I get it, you're a 42 Alpha, a human resources specialist. You fight battles with keyboards and staplers, but out here in the real world, readiness is everything." He was now standing directly in front of her, looming, his shadow swallowing her whole. "See this, men?" He gestured expansively to the assembled operators. "This is complacency. This is what happens when people forget we are at war. They sit behind a desk, lose their edge, and become a liability." The woman, Sergeant Anna Morgan, finally lifted her head. Her eyes, a flat neutral gray, met his. There was no fear in them, no anger, nothing at all. And that unnerved Thorne more than any defiance could have. "I am not a liability, Master Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, clear, carried no trace of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact. Thorne scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "Prove it." The challenge dripped with venom. "Right here, right now, get on the mat. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to demonstrate to everyone here what a real warrior looks like, and what a clerk looks like." He gestured to the open mat, a king inviting a peasant into his court. The crowd murmured, a mix of anticipation and discomfort. This had crossed a line from casual mockery to a formal public challenge. Colonel Evans remained silent on his perch, his gaze locked on Morgan. He recognized the trap Thorne was setting, but he also saw the utter lack of hesitation in the sergeant's posture. She placed her clipboard carefully on a nearby bench, her movements economical, precise. She walked onto the mat, her boots making no sound on the padded surface. She stood in the center, facing the behemoth instructor, and simply waited. She didn't put up her fists, didn't adopt a karate stance. She just stood there, a picture of serene composure, hands relaxed at her sides. Her stillness was an answer in itself, a silent rebuttal to his noisy aggression. And in that deafening silence, the balance of power in the room began to shift, tipping away from the loud, arrogant man, toward the quiet, unknown woman. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. What happens when silence becomes a weapon? The hangar was a tinderbox of anticipation. 250 elite soldiers, men who lived in breath-controlled violence, were utterly captivated. They'd expected her to refuse, to stammer an excuse, to be saved by an intervening officer. But there she stood, alone, a still figure in the center of the arena, facing a man who outweighed her by 100 pounds of solid muscle. Thorne circled her like a shark, a smirk plastered on his face, playing to the crowd, turning the demonstration into a piece of theater. "All right, sweetheart," he began, his voice condescendingly instructional. "Let's start simple, basic defensive stance. Put your hands up. You know, like this." He raised his own massive fists in an exaggerated boxing pose, drew a few chuckles from the assembled troops. Sergeant Morgan didn't move. She simply watched him, her gray eyes tracking his every motion with an unnerving placidity. Her stillness was beginning to work on him, fraying the edges of his confidence. He needed a reaction, a flicker of fear to validate his dominance. "Come on now. Don't just stand there like a statue. I'm going to come at you. I'll even tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to perform a simple collar grab. All you have to do is stop me. Just put your hands up and block me." He said it slowly, as if explaining the rules of a child's game. He began to move toward her, deliberately telegraphing his intention. His left hand, a slab of meat and calluses, reached out for the collar of her uniform. He wasn't aiming to strike. He was aiming to humiliate, to manhandle her, to drag her around the mat and prove his point about strength and weakness. From his vantage point, Colonel Evans leaned forward, knuckles white where he gripped the railing. He wasn't watching Thorne. He was watching Morgan's hands. They were still at her sides, but they were no longer completely relaxed. Her fingers were slightly curled, thumbs resting against her index fingers, the posture of a coiled spring, a system holding a massive amount of potential energy in perfect waiting equilibrium. The moment Thorne's hand entered her personal space, something extraordinary happened. Something most of the observers would only understand when they watched the slow-motion video later. Morgan moved, but moved was an inadequate word for what occurred. It was more like she simply existed in a different position. There was no visible acceleration, no dramatic wind-up. One moment she was still, hands at her sides. The next, her right hand had intercepted his wrist. Not grabbed it, intercepted it, redirected it. Her fingers wrapped around his hand with surgical precision. She didn't fight his momentum, she accepted it, redirected it, turned his own mass and aggression into a weapon against himself. Her left hand came up, not in a punch, in a gentle, almost tender placement against his elbow, creating a lever, a fulcrum, a simple machine. Thorne's brain was still processing the fact that she'd touched him when the pain arrived. A white-hot lightning bolt of agony that shot from his wrist to his shoulder to his brain. He tried to pull back, to reverse course, but the laws of physics were no longer on his side. His own strength, his own forward momentum was working against him. His body, conditioned through thousands of hours of combat training, recognized the trap and tried to compensate. But it was already too late. The snap was audible, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the silence of the hangar like a gunshot. Thorne's roar of pain followed immediately after, a primal sound of shock and agony that no amount of toughness could suppress. He dropped to his knees, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. His wrist hung at an unnatural angle. Morgan released him and stepped back. One step, two, her expression unchanged, her breathing even. She might as well have just completed a routine paperwork task. The hangar was silent, the kind of silence that follows a bomb blast, ears ringing, reality suspended. No one moved, no one spoke. They were all trying to reconcile what they'd just witnessed. The mountain had fallen, the clerk remained standing, and everything they thought they knew about strength had just been rewritten. Medical personnel rushed onto the mat. Thorne was escorted away, cradling his broken wrist, his face pale with shock. Morgan stood alone in the center of the mat. She hadn't moved, hadn't celebrated, hadn't even changed her expression. She simply waited for the next instruction, the next task. Colonel Evans descended from his platform, walked across the training floor. The crowd parted for him like water. He stopped in front of Morgan, studied her for a long moment. "Sergeant Morgan," he said quietly, "where did you train?" "Fort Bragg, sir. 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. 4 years, then selection. I was with the activity for 3 years before I transferred to administrative duties." The activity, the intelligence support activity, the Army's most secretive special operations unit, the people who didn't exist, who operated in places that didn't appear on maps, who solved problems that couldn't be acknowledged. Evans nodded slowly. Of course, it explained the stance, the economy of movement, the absolute lack of emotional display. She'd been trained by people who turned silence into an operational art form. "And you didn't think to mention this before?" Evans asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "It wasn't relevant to my current assignment, sir," Morgan replied. "I file reports, I process paperwork, that's what I'm here to do." "Noted," Evans said. Then louder, addressing the room, "Sergeant Morgan will not face any disciplinary action for this incident. Master Sergeant Thorne issued a direct challenge in front of witnesses. She responded appropriately to a physical threat." He paused. "Let that sink in. However, from this point forward, her background is to be treated as classified information. Anyone who discusses it outside of secure channels will answer to me personally. Understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," echoed through the hangar. Evans turned back to Morgan. "Dismissed, Sergeant." She retrieved her clipboard from the bench, walked off the mat with the same economical movements. The crowd parted for her too, but this time it wasn't dismissal, it was respect, raw, unfiltered, the kind earned in blood and bone. As she reached the exit, someone started clapping, slowly at first, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire hangar was applauding, not the mocking laughter from before, but genuine acknowledgement, a warrior's salute to one of their own. Morgan didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it. She simply pushed through the door and disappeared into the bright sunlight beyond. Inside, the operators looked at each other, then at the empty mat, then at the small damp spot where Thorne's sweat had fallen. The lesson had been delivered, not with words or lectures, but with undeniable, visceral truth. Assumptions are dangerous. Silence is not weakness, and the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one making noise. How do you become a legend without trying? The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, cell phone footage of the incident was circulating through secure military networks. By the next morning, it had reached forward operating bases on 3 continents. Special Forces operators in classified locations, sitting in ready rooms between missions, watched the video on loop, slowed it down, analyzed it frame by frame. What amazed them wasn't just the technique. It was the complete absence of ego. Morgan hadn't showboated, hadn't taunted, hadn't done anything except respond with the minimum necessary force to neutralize a threat. In a culture that often celebrated aggression and dominance, her restraint was revolutionary. Master Sergeant Thorne underwent surgery to repair his shattered wrist. 3 pins, 6 months of physical therapy. His hand would never be quite the same. More damaging than the physical injury was the psychological aftermath. The video had captured every moment. His arrogance, his condescension, his absolute certainty that he was superior. And then that certainty breaking apart in real time. He tried to return to his duties after medical clearance, tried to reclaim his position as the lead combat instructor, but something fundamental had changed. When he walked into a room, the easy respect he'd once commanded was gone, replaced by something else. Wariness, skepticism, a question that hung in the air. What else had he been wrong about? He requested a transfer, was granted one. Last anyone heard, he was teaching basic hand-to-hand combat to new recruits at a training facility in Kansas. A significant step down. He'd taken his humiliation and retreated, but before he left, he did one thing that surprised everyone. He found Morgan, 3 weeks after the incident. She was walking across the base, arms full of personnel files, heading to a meeting about deployment rotations. He called her name. She stopped, turned, her expression neutral, waiting. For a moment Thorne couldn't speak. His mouth opened, closed. The words he'd rehearsed dissolved in the face of her calm, patient gaze. "I wanted to apologize," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotions he wasn't used to processing. Shame, regret, recognition of his own failure. Morgan looked at him. Her gray eyes held no malice, no triumph. She simply nodded once. "Apology accepted, Master Sergeant." "I made assumptions," Thorne continued, the words coming faster now. "About you, about what you were capable of, about what mattered. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Morgan was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Thorne would carry with him for the rest of his career. "Assumptions are a heavy weight to carry. It's better to put them down." And with that she walked on, leaving him standing there, a man humbled by truth, finally beginning to understand the lesson she'd taught the entire command. Sergeant Morgan, for her part, deflected the sudden storm of attention with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else. She became a reluctant celebrity, a living legend whispered about in barracks and briefing rooms. Young operators, their faces full of awe, would approach her, ask her to show them the move, to explain the technique. She would politely decline to repeat the specific action, but she was generous with her philosophy. One evening, a young Green Beret captain found her in a quiet corner of the gym. She was practicing slow, deliberate movements that looked more like Tai Chi than combat, methodical, focused, present. "Sergeant Morgan," he asked tentatively, "I was there in the hangar. I've never seen anything like it. How did you do it? How did you stay so calm?" Morgan finished her movement before turning to him. Her answer was simple, direct, and would be repeated in training sessions for years to come. "There are two kinds of strength, Captain. There is the strength to crush things. That is loud. It is exhausting. It breaks itself against things that are stronger. Then there is the strength to redirect things. That is quiet. It is efficient. It uses the opponent's own power to defeat him." She pointed to a training dummy nearby. "The first kind of strength comes from the ego. The second kind comes from understanding. I wasn't calm because I knew I could beat him. I was calm because I refused to let his anger become my own." She paused, let the words settle. "He saw a target. I saw a system of levers and fulcrums. He wanted to fight. I simply solved a physics problem." Her words began to circulate, becoming a new kind of doctrine. Her philosophy of quiet competence was more impactful than any formal training session. She was teaching them to see the world not as a series of threats to be overpowered, but as a series of problems to be solved with intelligence and precision. The event created its own memorial. Someone printed a single high-resolution still frame from the video, the exact moment before the break, Morgan in perfect control, a picture of fluid grace. Thorne's face a mask of dawning horror. The photo was pinned to the main bulletin board in the close quarters combat training facility. Underneath it, an unknown hand had written a simple caption. Assume nothing. The spot on the mat where Thorne had fallen became sacred ground. New trainees were told the story, and the area was unofficially named Morgan's Corner. It was a constant physical reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the loudest, and that true respect is earned not through intimidation, but through the silent, undeniable demonstration of superior skill. The legend was no longer just a story. It had become part of the very fabric of the institution. Can a single moment change an entire culture? A year passed. Seasons changed. New soldiers cycled through the sprawling base. But the legacy of that day in Hangar 7 remained stronger than ever. It had become institutional folklore, a foundational story told to every new class of Special Forces candidates on their first day of close-quarters combat training. The new lead instructor, a battle-hardened command sergeant major with a quiet intensity that reminded everyone of Morgan, would begin every course the same way. She would gather the aspiring operators, a collection of the strongest, fastest, and most confident soldiers in the Army, and direct their attention to the framed photograph on the wall. It was the same photo that had first been pinned to the bulletin board, now professionally framed and mounted. Before we learn how to fight, she would begin, her voice resonating with authority, we are going to learn how to see. Look at this picture. Tell me what you see. The candidates would offer their observations. A small woman, a large man, a martial arts move. You see the surface, the instructor would reply. But you're not looking. You're seeing a moment in time that fundamentally changed the culture of this command. The man on the ground was Master Sergeant Rex Thorne. He was one of the most physically gifted instructors we ever had. The woman is Sergeant Anna Morgan. Her official job was Human Resources Specialist. She would let that sink in. Thorne saw a clerk. He made an assumption, and that assumption cost him his career. She would then walk them through the incident, not as a piece of gossip but as a tactical case study. She broke down Morgan's stance, the economy of her movement, the precise application of physics. She used it to teach the core principles of the program: leverage over strength, timing over speed, intelligence over aggression. Rule number 1 of asymmetric warfare, the instructor would declare, her eyes scanning the faces of the new recruits, is that you never, ever underestimate your opponent. You don't know their story. You don't know their training. You don't know what secrets they carry. The moment you assume you're superior, you have already lost. She would pause, let the weight of those words settle on young shoulders. Sergeant Morgan didn't defeat Master Sergeant Thorne with a wrist lock. She defeated him with a superior mindset. He was loud. She was quiet. He was arrogant. She was humble. He was a bully. She was a professional. Your goal is not to be the toughest person in the room. Your goal is to be the most competent. The story had become a powerful teaching tool. Its moral now woven into the DNA of the next generation of operators. It served as a permanent inoculation against the kind of arrogance that Thorne had embodied. But the true legacy of Sergeant Anna Morgan wasn't the broken wrist or the viral video. It was the quiet shift in perspective she had inspired. It was the young ranger who now took the time to talk to the quiet logistics specialist, learning she was a competitive chess master and gaining new insights into strategy. It was the SEAL team leader who, before a mission, consulted with a female intelligence analyst not just for her data, but for her perspective, valuing her intellect as much as any trigger puller's skill. Morgan's single act of quiet competence had done more to foster a climate of mutual respect than 1,000 mandatory training briefs on diversity and inclusion. She had proven, in the most visceral way possible, that worth is not determined by a label, a rank, or an appearance, but by demonstrated ability. She had taught an entire generation of warriors that silence is not weakness, that stillness is not fear, and that the most profound strength is the one that doesn't feel the need to announce itself. The change wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, subtle, like erosion reshaping a mountain. But it was real. Operators who once would have dismissed support personnel as non-hackers now listened when the intelligence specialist raised a concern. Team leaders who once valued only physical prowess now sought out diverse skill sets. The entire culture had shifted, not through policy or mandate, but through the power of a single undeniable example. Morgan herself remained largely unchanged. She continued her administrative duties with the same quiet efficiency, filed her reports, processed her paperwork, attended her meetings. She didn't seek recognition, didn't trade on her newfound status. She simply did her job, and in doing so reinforced the very lesson that had made her legendary. Competence doesn't advertise, it simply exists. One afternoon, nearly 18 months after the incident, a young female lieutenant fresh from West Point approached Morgan in the base cafeteria. The lieutenant was nervous, uncertain, struggling with the weight of being one of the few women in her platoon, feeling the pressure to prove herself, to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. "Sergeant Morgan," she began, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" Morgan looked up from her meal, nodded. How do you deal with it, with being underestimated, with people making assumptions?" Morgan was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she spoke. "I don't deal with it, ma'am. I use it. Every assumption someone makes about me is information. It tells me what they value, what they fear, what they don't understand, and that information is an advantage." The lieutenant frowned. "But doesn't it bother you when they dismiss you?" "Only if I accept their assessment," Morgan replied. "But I don't. I know my capabilities, I know my training, I know my worth. Their opinion doesn't change any of that. It only reveals their limitations, not mine." She took a sip of water, continued. "The world will always underestimate someone. That's a constant. The question is, will you let that underestimation define you, or will you let your actions speak for themselves?" The lieutenant nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "You didn't break Master Sergeant Thorne's wrist to prove a point," she said. "No," Morgan agreed. "I broke it because he gave me no choice. The lesson came later, when people realized their assumptions didn't match reality. And now people make different assumptions. Some see me as a legend, some see me as a symbol, but I'm neither. I'm just someone who showed up, did the job, and didn't let anyone else's limitations become my own." The lieutenant stood, straightened. "Thank you, Sergeant." Morgan simply nodded, returned to her meal. The conversation was over, but the lesson had been delivered, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. That was Morgan's way, to teach without preaching, to lead without commanding, to inspire without seeking inspiration. What does true legacy look like? Years later, Colonel Evans, now a retired general, would often be asked about the most impressive soldier he had ever served with. People expected him to name a famous general, a highly decorated commando, someone whose name appeared in history books and Medal of Honor citations. But he would always tell the story of a quiet sergeant, a woman who, in a single silent moment, reminded an army of its own core values. He would describe that day in the hangar, the tension, the confrontation, the absolute stillness before the storm, and then he would explain what most people missed, what made the moment truly extraordinary. "It wasn't the technique," he would say. "Any well-trained operative could execute that wrist lock. What made Sergeant Morgan exceptional was her complete lack of emotion, her absolute refusal to be drawn into Thorne's narrative." He would lean back, remember. Thorne wanted a fight, he wanted drama, he wanted to prove his dominance, and Morgan gave him none of it. She simply responded to a physical threat with the minimum necessary force. No anger, no ego, no vendetta, just competence. He would pause, let his audience absorb that. That's the hardest thing to teach. That's the rarest quality in any warrior. The ability to remain calm, to see clearly, to respond appropriately, not to escalate, not to prove anything, just to do what needs to be done. Evans would often conclude with a broader reflection. True legacy is not a name carved on a memorial wall. It's not a list of medals in a display case. It's not what you leave behind. It's what continues to move forward because you were there. It's the standard you set, the lesson you teach, the quiet inspiration that encourages others to be more observant, more humble, and more professional. Anna Morgan left no statue, no building named in her honor. She simply left behind a better, smarter, and more respectful generation of warriors to guard the nation. Her legacy was silence, and it was deafening. The training facility still displays that photograph. New classes still hear the story. Morgan's Corner remains a sacred space where arrogance goes to die and humility is born. The caption beneath the photo, "Assume nothing," has become an unofficial motto, a two-word philosophy that captures everything Morgan taught without saying a word. But perhaps the most profound measure of her impact isn't found in the stories or the sacred spaces. It's found in the small, daily choices of the operators who learned from her example. It's the senior NCO who listens to the youngest private's suggestion during mission planning. It's the team leader who values the input of the female linguist as much as the male weapons sergeant. It's the commander who judges people by their demonstrated competence rather than their appearance or background. These aren't dramatic moments. They don't make headlines. They won't be written up in after-action reports, but they represent a fundamental shift in culture, a movement away from toxic masculinity and toward professional excellence, a recognition that strength comes in many forms, and that the quietest voice in the room might also be the wisest. Morgan herself eventually retired from military service. She left quietly, just as she had lived. No fanfare, no ceremony beyond the standard retirement formation. She simply turned in her gear, signed her final paperwork, and walked off the base for the last time. Some say she became a counselor, helping veterans transition to civilian life, teaching them the same philosophy she demonstrated in that hangar, that true strength isn't about domination, it's about understanding, control, precision. Others say she disappeared entirely, living a quiet life somewhere far from the military world, growing a garden, reading books, finding peace in simplicity. The truth is, no one knows for certain, and that's exactly how Morgan would want it. She never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to do her job, to serve with competence and dignity, to be judged by her actions rather than her appearance. And in the end, she achieved something far greater than recognition. She changed the way an entire institution thinks about strength, respect, and competence. She proved that one person, acting with quiet professionalism in a single moment, can shift the trajectory of thousands of lives. The operators who witnessed that day in Hangar 7 are now senior leaders. They're training the next generation. And when they do, they carry Morgan's lessons with them. Not because they were ordered to, but because they saw with their own eyes the power of quiet competence, the strength of restraint, the wisdom of humility. They learned that the most dangerous warrior isn't the one who roars. It's the one who waits, who watches, who understands, who acts only when necessary, and who, when action is required, moves with such precision and economy that the fight is over before anyone realizes it began. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And in that action it says everything that needs to be said. It writes lessons that echo through generations. It creates ripples that become waves. It transforms institutions from the inside out, not through force or volume, but through the undeniable power of silent, unshakable competence. That was Anna Morgan's gift to the warriors who came after her. Not a technique, not a trick, Not a secret move that could be learned and replicated, but a mindset, a way of being, a reminder that true strength doesn't need to announce its presence. It simply waits, patient, ready, still, until the moment it's needed, and then it moves with the inevitability of physics, the precision of mathematics, the grace of someone who understands that the quietest answer is often the truest one. Sergeant Anna Morgan taught an army to listen to silence, to value stillness, to see strength in unexpected places, and to never, ever make assumptions about the person holding the clipboard. Because sometimes that person is the most dangerous warrior in the room, and you'll only learn that lesson once.